It begins quietly, almost too quietly for a world so loud, so distracted, so convinced that Africa's story has already been written for it. But beneath the surface of the headlines, something powerful is shifting. The winds over the Sahara, the waters along the Gulf of Guinea, even the long, quiet corridors of diplomacy across the Sahel, they all seem to echo the same truth. Africa is no longer rising. Africa is repositioning the balance of global power. For decades, Americans, especially those of us who have lived long enough to watch Cold Wars rise and fall, were told a simple narrative. Africa was a place to help to manage, to stabilize, a continent where others made decisions, and Africa simply endured the consequences. But today, that old story is collapsing, and the world is watching stunned because Africa is not asking anyone for permission this time. In the span of just a few years, something unprecedented has happened. 46 African nations have entered more than $4 billion in military and technological cooperation with Russia, not in secret, not in fear, but openly, confidently, and with a very clear message: we choose our own partners now. And suddenly Washington, Paris, London, they aren't lecturing anymore. They're worried. So here is the question for all of us, those who have lived long enough to recognize a historical turning point when it appears: why is Africa's new path towards sovereignty causing more panic in the West than pride? Is it the partnership with Moscow, or is it the realization that Africa no longer needs Western approval to stand on its own feet? As we move through this story, keep one thing in mind: leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso didn't rise by accident. They rose because the continent hit its limit and decided to rewrite the rules. This is the Africa news many never expected to see in their lifetime. If you believe that understanding the truth matters more than repeating old narratives, please stay with us. And if you feel this awakening deserves to be heard, don't forget to share and subscribe as we continue. For many years, Africa lived inside a script written somewhere else, usually in Washington, Paris, or Brussels. The continent's security depended on foreign advisors, foreign bases, and foreign funding. Most Americans over 60 remember this era clearly: news networks showing African soldiers trained by U.S. instructors, French bases scattered across the Sahel, and Western leaders promising democracy and stability. But beneath these promises was something quieter, something far more dangerous: dependency carefully enforced through loans, conditions, and the constant reminder that Africa needed supervision. That illusion held for decades, until it didn't. The breaking point came from the heart of the Sahel, a stretch of land long dismissed as unstable and ungovernable. And yet this is precisely where the shift began. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three nations battered by insurgency, foreign intervention, and broken promises, looked at the results of years under Western guidance and saw the same outcome every time: insecurity, poverty, and humiliation. Their people kept asking, how do we have the resources but not the power? The silence that followed that question became unbearable. So these nations did something unthinkable in the old world order. They said enough. The decision wasn't spontaneous. It was born from frustration, from funerals of young soldiers, from villages abandoned to violence, from years of watching foreign missions operate with little to show. The people demanded answers, and the governments, new, young, untraditional, finally listened. They began expelling foreign troops, questioning old treaties, and demanding transparency in every military partnership. Western capitals labeled these moves dangerous. But for the people on the ground, it felt like breathing for the first time in decades. And then came the moment that changed everything. Russia entered the picture not with speeches about values, not with political lectures, but with a simple, direct offer: let's build your strength, not your dependence. Quietly at first, African defense ministers began signing agreements for equipment maintenance, training, weapons, upgrades, and technology transfers. Engineers from Congo, Uganda, Cameroon, and Angola traveled to Russian academies. Russian technicians visited African bases to repair systems long neglected by Western contractors. In just a few short years, the number became impossible to ignore: 46 African countries entering more than $4 billion in military cooperation with Moscow. This wasn't the usual model where Africa buys and the West profits. These contracts were designed so that African soldiers learn to operate and maintain everything themselves. No permanent foreign advisors, no hidden political clauses, no conditions about elections, budgets, or foreign policy. For many African leaders, this was the first time a major power treated them not as a student or a subordinate, but as a partner. Inside the continent, the emotional impact was even stronger than the strategic one. In Ouagadougou, young officers stood before newly delivered equipment, realizing they would soon train their own local units without waiting months for parts from Europe. In Bamako, soldiers who once relied on outdated gear finally held tools capable of defending their villages. In Niamey, commanders walked across bases that once flew NATO flags, now preparing to convert them into national command centers. Across Africa, the transformation felt almost symbolic. It wasn't about weapons, it was about dignity. Western governments reacted with alarm, calling these partnerships aggressive, destabilizing, and dangerous. But ordinary Africans saw something entirely different, a path to independence that finally made sense, one grounded not in slogans, but in capability. For the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't waiting for help, it was preparing to help itself. And the world could feel the ground shifting. The turning point didn't arrive with a speech or a ceremony. It arrived with silence, the kind of silence that follows a decision no one can reverse. In capitals across the Sahel, foreign troops began packing their equipment. Helicopters took off from airstrips that had been controlled by Western forces for years. And for the first time in decades, Africans stood watching not as spectators, but as owners of their own soil. The images were powerful French soldiers leaving their long-standing bases in Mali and Burkina Faso, NATO advisors quietly departing Niger, Western flags being lowered for the last time. To outsiders, these withdrawals looked like logistical moves. To Africans, they were the sound of chains breaking. Ordinary citizens stood behind barricades or on balconies, recording the moment with their phones whispering to each other, "Is this really happening?" But the real shock came from the reactions in Western capitals. Suddenly, major newspapers that rarely reported on Africa began pushing urgent headlines, Russian influence growing in Sahel Africa, turning away from democracy, a new Cold War brewing. Television hosts warned of destabilization, foreign manipulation, and the threat of Moscow. Yet something was missing from all those headlines, the voice of Africans themselves. While the West panicked, the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey were filled with an emotion Western analysts rarely understood relief. Tens of thousands of citizens gathered in city squares waving national flags, not because they loved conflict, but because for the first time someone had listened to their demand for sovereignty. Their chants were not about Russia or the West, they were about themselves. We decide our own future. Inside government halls, the shift was even more dramatic. Defense ministers received Russian and regional delegations with the confidence of leaders who finally had leverage. No more whispered conversations. No more fear of being punished for choosing the wrong partner. Instead, they were signing agreements that centered African priorities, training, maintenance, technological autonomy, cybersecurity, drone operations, and the rebuilding of national command structures. And while Western governments tried to dismiss the shift as a temporary rebellion, the symbolic changes happening within African societies told a different story. Courtrooms began adopting traditional dress instead of Western suits, a quiet but powerful message that identity was no longer negotiable. Military academies updated their curriculum to include regional strategies instead of foreign doctrines. Journalists, long used to echoing Western narratives, started asking harder questions. Why were we told for so long that we cannot defend ourselves? Why were our resources exported, but our armies left under-equipped? The most dramatic emotional wave came from Africa's youth. For generations, young Africans saw Western soldiers patrolling their streets, Western advisors dictating reforms, and Western institutions deciding loan terms. Many grew up believing sovereignty was something spoken about, not lived. But now images of newly trained African commanders, regional military drills, and modernized equipment began circulating online. Suddenly, sovereignty wasn't a slogan. It was visible, tangible, believable. And while this transformation produced pride across Africa, it produced something very different in Washington, Paris, and Brussels fear. Not fear of Russia, but fear of Africa with options. Because an Africa that can defend its borders doesn't need foreign peacekeepers. An Africa that can negotiate confidently doesn't accept unfair contracts. An Africa that can train its own officers doesn't need foreign consultants. This was the true crisis in Western strategic circles, the realization that the continent they once shaped was now shaping itself. As Western diplomats scrambled to repair relations, something even more unsettling happened. Their influence was fading faster than they could respond. Negotiations that once took months now took weeks. Leaders who once hesitated now made decisions with clarity. Africa had crossed a threshold, and thresholds once crossed do not invite retreat. In the Sahel, the emotional climax came from a simple truth whispered among young officers and elders alike. We were never weak, we were restricted. That single realization shared from one generation to another was the spark that pushed Africa from quiet frustration into full sovereignty. It was the moment the world understood that this partnership wave wasn't about Moscow at all. It was about Africans reclaiming something they were told they didn't deserve power without permission. The political ripple began slowly, almost invisibly, like the first tremor before an earthquake. But once Africa reclaimed control over its security, the consequences spread into every corner of civic life. For the first time in decades, the ability to protect the nation no longer rested in foreign hands. And that single shift transformed not just armies, but societies. The first and most immediate change happened inside government institutions. Ministers who once hesitated to challenge Western-backed policies suddenly found their voices. Laws that had been postponed for years, especially those regulating mines' borders and national resources, were revived. Parliamentary chambers that once echoed with debates shaped by foreign consultants now filled with local priorities, protection of land control of gold and uranium, investment in national defense, and rebuilding regional alliances. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Sovereignty was no longer symbolic, it was actionable. Outside the political halls, the impact on ordinary citizens was even more profound. In towns across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, people reported something they had not felt in many years, a sense of national dignity. Shopkeepers spoke proudly of local soldiers trained at home instead of by foreign missions. Teachers incorporated new chapters into their history lessons about African-built defense systems and regional solidarity. Families long accustomed to seeing foreign uniforms as the default presence of power now watched their own young men and women take command. For many elders, this shift stirred deep emotions. They remembered the decades after independence when African leaders dreamed of real autonomy but lacked the tools to make it happen. They had seen that hope collapse under coups, debt traps, and foreign interference. Now, watching new defense institutions rise, they whispered to their grandchildren, "This is what we waited for." But the social transformation didn't end with pride. It created momentum. Across the Sahel, thousands of young Africans applied to join engineering schools, drone academies, cyber defense institutes, and officer training programs. For the first time, military service wasn't seen merely as a job, it was seen as a contribution to national rebirth. The training was tough, the standards high, but the purpose behind it lifted their spirits. They were part of Africa's long-delayed turning point. This wave of national pride altered political alliances as well. Leaders who aligned with sovereignty movements saw unprecedented public support. Those who tried to cling to old Western partnerships found themselves challenged by their own citizens. Demonstrations erupted not to protest insecurity, but to demand that governments protect the new autonomy at all costs. If Western pressure returned, the people wanted to be the first line of defense. Internationally, the consequences were equally significant. Nations like France and the United States, long accustomed to unchallenged influence, suddenly faced African counterparts negotiating from positions of strength. Diplomats noticed the tone shift immediately. Gone were the timid requests for aid or training. In their place were firm declarations Africa would decide its partners, its strategies, and its future. This newfound assertiveness led to policy changes that once seemed impossible. Several states announced audits of old mining contracts. Others initiated plans to convert former foreign bases into national research centers and military academies. Some even began exploring joint African manufacturing of weapons and surveillance systems. Every step, every announcement, every new program carried the same unspoken message: Africa is preparing to stand without leaning on anyone. Yet perhaps the most striking change was psychological. Slowly, steadily, Africans stopped seeing themselves through the lens of foreign assessments, unstable, underdeveloped, in need of guidance. Instead, they began to see themselves as protagonists of a new era. The old dependency mindset, once woven deeply into government culture and daily life, started to dissolve. The West underestimated this shift. They assumed political consequences would be temporary. But what they missed is that sovereignty, once embraced, becomes a habit and then an identity. Africa was no longer asking the world, "What should we do?" It was telling the world, "Watch what we choose to build." From Washington's perspective, the shift unfolding across Africa is not just unusual, it is unsettling. For decades, American policymakers viewed the continent through the same familiar lens, a place needing support, security, and structure provided by U.S. partnerships. Many senior officials who served through the Cold War, the War on Terror, and the era of counterinsurgency see Africa as a region where American military presence was not just helpful, but essential. But today that belief is being challenged in ways the U.S. establishment has never experienced before. The first shock came when intelligence briefings showed African nations moving decisively toward Russian cooperation, not hesitantly, not secretly, but publicly. For many American analysts, the question wasn't why Russia. The painful question was, why not us? And the answer, though uncomfortable, was becoming clear. African nations felt the West had decades to prove the value of its partnerships, and didn't. In think tanks across Washington, Brookings, CSIS RAND experts gathered to reassess American strategy. They noted a painful truth: Africa was not turning toward Russia because of ideology. It was turning because of respect, because Moscow presented deals without insults, conditions, lectures, or reminders of superiority. And that simplicity forced a hard reassessment of American diplomacy. Across the Atlantic, Europe faced its own crisis of relevance. France, once deeply entrenched in Sahel politics, watched its influence collapse almost overnight. Diplomats in Paris spoke of losing the Francophone world, while newspapers framed the shift as a geopolitical disaster. But the real disaster, as many Africans saw it, was that for years these countries treated Africa like a permanent minor, never an equal. Meanwhile, in London and Brussels, leaders realized something even more troubling: the unity among Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger was inspiring others. Nations in East Central and Southern Africa began revisiting their own military agreements. Some launched reviews of old mining contracts. Others quietly signaled interest in diversifying their alliances. What began in the Sahel was spreading through Africa like a wave of clarity. Then came the global reaction from non-Western nations. Countries like India, Brazil, China, and the broader BRICS alliance viewed the African transformation not as instability, but as opportunity, a sign that the world was finally moving toward multipolarity. For these nations, Africa represented not a zone to control, but a partner to collaborate with. And the success of leaders such as Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré only strengthened this sentiment. His insistence on sovereignty resonated far beyond his borders, appearing regularly in Africa news and provoking conversations that Western capitals preferred to avoid. This shift alarms the United States for a reason deeper than military contracts. If Africa becomes fully sovereign politically, economically, and militarily, it breaks a century-old assumption that global leadership must always flow from the West. It challenges the belief that only Western institutions can determine legitimacy, and it threatens systems built on dependency rather than partnership. For older Americans who remember the Cold War, this moment may feel familiar, but in truth, it is entirely new. This is not a battle between superpowers. It is a continent discovering its voice after generations of silence. And that voice is asking the world a question the West has never had to answer honestly. If we choose our own path, will you still treat us as equals? As this story comes full circle, one truth becomes unmistakable. Africa is entering a century that will be defined not by how others see it, but by how it sees itself. For generations, the continent was spoken for, measured, monitored, and managed through foreign systems that promised stability but delivered dependency. Today, that era is ending, and we are witnessing something far more profound than new alliances or military contracts. We are witnessing a psychological awakening. Across the Sahel and far beyond, ordinary people who once felt invisible in global affairs are beginning to understand their own power. Young officers rebuild national command structures. Elders watch their flags rise over bases once controlled by outsiders. Families speak of sovereignty not as a dream, but as a daily reality taking shape. And leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso have become symbols of this new spirit, appearing again and again in Africa news as voices who refuse to bend to old pressures. But with every awakening comes a warning. History has shown us that when nations stand up, someone else often tries to push them back down. The question now is not whether Africa can rise, it already has. The question is whether the world, especially the West, is prepared to accept that rise without fear or interference. Because if this transformation continues the global order as we've known it, an order shaped by Western military influence, financial control, and political expectations, will have to evolve or collapse. For Americans over 60 who have watched decades of geopolitical shifts from Vietnam to the fall of the Berlin Wall, this moment may feel both familiar and startling. Familiar because the world is once again rearranging itself. Startling because this time the catalyst is not a superpower, but a continent long underestimated. And perhaps the most powerful part of this story is that Africa no longer asks for permission. That door has closed. The new door leads directly to a future the continent is building with its own hands. So let me leave you with two questions. Questions only you, the viewer, can answer. If Africa no longer needs permission to rise, will the rest of the world finally treat it as an equal? And more personally, do you believe the path chosen by leaders like Ibrahim Traoré is strong enough to reshape global leadership for good, or should Africa search for someone else to guide this new era? If you feel you're among the first to truly understand this shift, please share this video. If you believe that truth matters more than old headlines, subscribe and stay with us. And if you care about a world built on dignity rather than dependency, your voice belongs in the comments below. The story of Africa is changing, and this time the world is not the author. Africa is.